I wonder on a very practical level, James, like how do you get churches to maybe have some of these conversations? Is that anything ICRD is even attempting to do? Is that a goal or an objective? Um, and like, do you facilitate those spaces? Is it through email? Like, because I think part of the piece you had mentioned that I wanted to bring back up too was just you have to have the right messenger, and that they carry the context, and they have that credibility that's already established. And but let's, I guess, how do you get the church to maybe, if at all, and I'm making it about the church because it is just the avenue we're on topic of today. So
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, we are engaging in that work domestically. One of the things that I think, at least in my experience, a lot of faith traditions struggle with a bit of a identity polarity, right? There are people in the tradition who think I'm under the protection of the divine because I'm doing the right thing, and anyone who's out is excluded and maybe is a legitimate target for me to harm. And then there are adherents and believers who think the divine is natural. And I use the divine because it's a broad term, right? So God, Allah, wherever people find their sense of divinity, the divine is inclined towards human well-being, right? Particularly a creator God, a loving creator God, which is very much the Christian, Godhead. Therefore, what does that look like if I'm manifesting the intentions of the divine, right? Am I acting out of the principles of love and healing? Even if I disagree with the person, I want to change them. Or am I acting out of the principles of anger and harm, hatred and harm? And for some groups of adherents, that hatred and harm is a legitimate manifestation of divine will. And for others, it's not, because when they describe what is divinity, what is the characteristic of their God, uh, hatred and minimizing and harming humans is not, that doesn't fit their model of what creator God would want for humanity, right? So maybe transformation is okay, but transformation with what? With what intention? Love or hatred? Healing or harm, right? And if you're doing that, people talk about, well, tough love and this, that, and the other thing. And I know there's a lot of stuff, the Bible is an interesting text. The Old Testament and New Testament kind of lean in different directions when it comes to this. And that's part of the spiritual journey of working with that sacred text. Because there's punishment and things. And I think people will lean towards that kind of tough love. You've got to hurt the other, or even worse, the idea of kind of cosmic war, that if you actually disagree with me, you're actually the devil, not just an agent of the devil, but the devil walking in the world. I know that's a part of the narrative now in some of these communities. And again, that's that intra-faith tension, right? But within that, there's plenty to incline people the other direction. So finding those voices who say, if we're trying to manifest God into God's creation, to use that language, the Christian language, right? Then are we actually manifesting God if we're doing it with a spirit of harm? And there are ways to engage in those conversations. Now, these days in certain spaces, it's a real challenge, and you better know your audience, right? And so our first task was to go, as I mentioned at the beginning, and listen. We did about 8 or 10 cities with a pilot project with some funds that we had actually meant to employ in Lebanon, but Lebanon was going through some really tough times, and my interfaith people said it wasn't really a good time to be doing stuff in Lebanon on that publicly. So we asked if we could shift the money here, because this was in the lead up to January 6th and everything, when it was the height of kind of COVID resistance was happening, and Black Lives Matter was marching, and the counter protests, and the rhetoric was building up. So we said, can we use this money to look around and see what could be the healing role of religious belief in this space, particularly in spaces where religion is inclining people towards wanting to do harm. So that's kind of why we ended up in a somewhat conservative space, because there is a crossover there of strong religious identity, strong political action, and the weapons of violence. Not that weapons of violence are exclusively there, but the religious overlay is. I honestly think that on a very atheistic or agnostic front or anti-religious front on the left, if I can use those terms, left and right, and I think those are false binaries, but there's been a big manifestation of violence as well, where religion is part of it. It's just the rejection of religious identity, and that's got to come into this conversation as soon as we can get it into this conversation, because I don't believe in nor want to be perceived as pointing at conservative evangelicals and saying they're the problem. I'm actually not. I'm doing the opposite. I'm pointing at them and saying they can be part of the solution, but everyone's that isn't part of that group is saying they're the problem, and that's wrong. Let's go talk to them and find the folks who say, I'm conservative, I'm religious, I'm not sure I like all this other stuff in my society, but I know that God wants me to heal and not harm, and I'm going to make my community hear that, because that's my prophetic task as a pastor. So that's where we've located ourselves. And we're working with those pastors right now on processes of really understanding what the challenges are. And they're different in each community. There are places where, folks have left, houses of worship are emptying out because people are going to the radical pastor who's calling for violence. They're drawn to that right now. And so that those pastors are navigating, hey, how do I not become that person, but not lose my community at the same time, where I have influence, because I won't have any influence. It's just me standing here on the Sundays. And then there are others who are saying, I get these folks once a week for an hour, and the news media has them the rest of the time, and the Twitter feed or whatever it's being called these days, X feed or social media feed, has them the rest of the time. How do I push back against that? Especially when these days, none of us know if what we're seeing, hearing, or reading is even true, right? Because of the power of misinformation. We're operating at the very least from two radically different realities. I mean, literally different realities. It's not that we have a different feeling about what should we do about a reality. We don't agree on the reality. That's a hard place to start a conversation, right? So we're working with those pastors now to really kind of unpack and identify, where are the challenges they can address. And I was listening to one of these podcasts before that you all did with Cure Violence Leadership, and there was a moment in there where the conversation was, sometimes you have to just go at the thing you can affect now, even though you're excluding other things that are really important. And that's true. I mean, that's the nature of this work. But I want to go back. There's one other thing I want to say, and I should have said early on. Conflict itself is not bad, right? Conflict is value neutral, really. I lean on John Paul Lederach's work on this, the Mennonite peace builder. A conflict is what causes new relationships and new institutions to emerge that better serve the people that they're trying to serve, or the communities that are in relationship. United States history is littered with conflicts, some really grotesque, that I like to think in many cases has improved us. One of the things I'm very concerned about right now is this absolute unwillingness for anyone to admit that they're wrong about something, right? I always tell my team, when you go to do a job, when you have a program, you're going to go start on the assumption you're wrong. Not about everything, but about something, because then you come in with humility and you come in with adaptability. But there's this narrative now, either everything is totally right or everything is totally wrong. You can't criticize one group for anything at all or another group for anything at all without being some sort of identity traitor. And you're given this whole package of beliefs. If you're going to be this, you have to have all of this other stuff. And I agree with you. People are getting tired of that. I think that's actually a bright spot, is folks are saying, wait a minute, I'm tired of being told who I am just because I'm this, right? I would like to go back to being able to decide who I want to be on with some nuance. You know, maybe I agree with those guys on this point, even though I deeply, vociferously disagree with them on this other stuff. Maybe one of the things that my people want us to do, I'm not comfortable with. But where can I say that? Who can I say that to? So we're trying to find areas where we can start to build kind of landing spaces for folks who want to get back to negotiating their own identity a little bit, right? Not having to throw things out and not having to embrace things, but saying, wait, I'm not all that and I'm not all this. I'm actually okay with a little bit in between. And when that starts to happen, then they're going to find more people who meet them in that space who disagree with them on some of the other stuff. Now we're back to that multiplicity of identity that Amartya Sen writes about so powerfully in his book, Identity and Violence. And, you know, singularity of identity being such a driver of violence and conflict. Violent conflict, because again, conflict that gets transformed into something new and better is great, right? It's what you do with it. But if you can multiply those identities, again, you're an Eagles fan, you can't be all bad, right? Then you start to build pathways for empathy and understanding. And now we're back into the mix of social difference and nuance and people being able to allow each other to be different and find ways that they can do that while still holding their convictions, because that's what this is. Again, our institutions are meant to protect and enshrine. I mean, if there is our way of life, which I hear a lot about, it's that. It's that. It's define who you want to be without hurting others, but then let them be who they want to be without hurting you. We got to get into the nitty gritty about what hurt means, right? Right now, we're pretty extreme on hurt. If you think a thing, if you say a thing, if you believe a thing, you're inherently hurting me. Well, that's taking it a little far. We got to dial that back a little.